Welcome everyone to this part one of two parts on the Last Supper, and this is found in the Gospel account. We hope that you enjoy it. And again, this is a study from Yah's covenant calendar, and the approximate date is Abib in the year of the crucifixion. And all the studies can be found at studythecalendar.com. And just like we said, the Last Supper is going to have two parts. Part one tonight is going to be the controversy over the date of the Last Supper. Was it Abib 13 or was it Abib 14? And the big question is, was the Last Supper the Passover meal? In part two, we're going to be looking at both types of bread that were at the Last Supper table, but only one bread can represent Yahusha's body. So that will be coming up in part two. What was the day and the month date of the Last Supper? Abib 13, is it a yes or a no? Abib 14, what is it? A yes or a no? Because there was leavened bread present the evening of that Last Supper, that alone would disqualify this supper as being the Passover meal that was supposed to be eaten on Abib 14. However, that is only one witness. What about John 13:1? You know, John 13:1 really should settle the question. And this is what it says. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Yahusha knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father. Do you notice that verse 1 plainly states the timing was before the feast of Passover, which is always on the 14th day of the first month. So logic demands the betrayal of Yahusha must occur before his sacrifice on the tree. And what about verse 2? And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray him. That's what it says in verse 2. So what we find is that in verse 2, John shows the Last Supper took place on the same night that Judas Iscariot betrayed Yahusha. So if it isn't the 13th, then when is it? When did this actually take place? Again, we're going to be asking these questions. What day or what date? And I would like you to note that this study is going to be given according to the dawn day start. Why does it matter when the Last Supper was celebrated as compared to Passover? Well, it's because of this question. Was it on Abib 13, on a third cycle, which is a Tuesday? Was this Last Supper on Abib 14, which would be considered a fourth cycle and a Wednesday? Or perhaps it would be neither. Maybe it's neither one. Well, there's going to be three more witnesses that we want to look at in this study. Number one is going to be John. We're going to look at chapters 13, 18, and 19. In the second part, we're going to look at the phrase, with desire I desired. What does that mean? And number three, we're going to look at a very special meal. But first, we're going to look at Daniel 9:27. We're going to magnify that midst of the week, and we're going to be doing a little review on the Synoptic Gospels. So what is the controversy for part one? Well, I'd like you to take a note. If the type of bread could have settled the whole controversy of whether the Last Supper was either on Abib 13 or Abib 14, or whether it was on a Tuesday, a third cycle, a Wednesday, a fourth cycle, or maybe even a Thursday, the fifth cycle, you know what? Our study would be done. However, there are some other questions that we need to consider. Number one, does the day commence with sunset? And number two, does the day commence with dawn light? And number three, is the Passover meal ever eaten 21 hours in advance of a Passover sacrifice? Now that's something to think about. The argument is this: If the Passover meal is eaten before the Passover sacrifice takes place, how is that going to align with the Torah instructions that are given in Exodus 12? Talk about conflicting opinions. There is a lot of them. What do you think about these different opinions? Number one, Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the Last Supper was eaten on the last night of Yahusha's life. Most people would say that's a thumbs up. Number two, most tend to believe that Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the Last Supper is the same as the Passover meal. Now remember, most people believe that. But is that really true? So do we have a thumbs up or a thumbs down? And number three, John shows clearly that the Last Supper occurred before the Passover feast. That's very clear in John. So is there a way to reconcile these differing opinions? Well, what we need to do is consider some facts first. Gospel writers would have followed the Torah. We can be quite sure about that. In Exodus 12:6, it says that the Passover lambs were to be killed between the evenings on Abib 14. Now, the Jews have traditionally interpreted between the evenings to mean in the afternoon. At the time of Yahusha, the priests sacrificed the Passover lambs in the afternoon of Abib 14. In the book, The Wars of the Jews, Josephus records many Passover lambs were slaughtered from the 9th hour till the 11th hour, and that would be according to the dawn day. And I'd just like you to note that on the Roman clock today, that would be understood as from 3 o'clock in the afternoon until 5 o'clock in the evening. And Tim is going to help us with some of the presentations. So Tim, we'll just have you go ahead.
This is the historical account from Josephus. So these high priests, upon the coming of their feast, which is called the Passover, when they slay their sacrifices from the 9th hour to the 11th, that is 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Roman time, but so that a company not less than 10 belong to every sacrifice, and many of us are 20 in a company, found this number of sacrifices was 256,500. I'll say that again, 256,500, which, upon the allowance of no more than 10 that feast together, amounts to 2,700,200 persons that were pure and holy. This is what we find in the Josephus book of War of the Jews. So let's compare this quote to the prophecy given in Daniel 9:27. Can it apply there?
So we're just going to look at a couple of charts with Daniel 9:27 because it's one of those very important verses. And the chart is very, very simple. So just have a look at it. Daniel 9:27, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Now, don't forget that this chart is according to a dawn day start. We will have a chart a little bit later on trying to figure out if sunset start will work as well. So we have our first, second, and third cycle. The midst of the week is going to be the middle day of the week or the fourth cycle. And if you do a midst of the week with a dawn day, you will find that the exact midst of the week is going to be the Arev of the fourth cycle right there. You will have an equal number of hours on either side of the Arev. So I'd like you to keep that information in mind as we consider the information in the Gospels. This prophetic account from Daniel is one of the most important, and I just love it. Again, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So what does that mean? Well, on his Passover day, Most of us will remember that at the 6th hour, when Yahusha was on the tree, that was when the sun went dark. It turned very, very dark at the 6th hour. And what does Josephus tell us? That the sacrifices were completed by the 11th hour of the day. That would be counting from dawn. Remember, this is all according to a dawn day start. At the 12th hour, this would also fulfill the Daniel 9 prophecy, because the 12th hour is going to be the marker for Erev. And this is on the 4th cycle, and that is the exact midst of the week. And then the rest of the day continues on into the night season. And when you have the dawn approaching in the morning, that is the beginning of your Sabbath of unleavened bread. So this is what Daniel 9:27 is talking about. The midst of the week is right there at Erev. Well, Tim, this is a very interesting slide about Daniel 9:27. Can you go ahead and explain this?
Yeah, an interesting title. Yahusha, a divine corpse? Interesting title. Daniel 9:27. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So there we have midst of the week. That is the 12th hour. And that is the exact location of the midst of the week. It is the midst of the week is not at 3 p.m. when he died. At the moment of sunset, that is the 12th hour, the sacrifice of Yahusha terminated. Yahusha was still on the tree. He was dead at that point, but he was still a sacrifice until after Joseph brought him down from the tree. He was still serving the visible sacrifice. At Erev, Joseph of Arimathea requested and removed his emaciated body from the tree. At that point, Yahusha was a divine corpse in waiting. So at that point, the midst of the week, he transferred from a divine sacrifice to a divine corpse to be prepared for burial.
Yes. Well, I hope that everyone can see that that midst of the week works out just perfect when you start with the dawn day. But what if you try to chart the sunset as the day start? If you have a day commencing at sunset, and we're going to be using these bronze markers, what is going to mark the exact midst of the week when you start with a sunset? Can this option for the midst of the week hour fulfill the Daniel 9:27 prophecy? And will it align with the quote from Josephus? So we're just going to count out 3.5 days again for this tricky question. Don't forget, we're starting with the darkness here, basically sunset. And after our first 24 hours, we have our second marker. So that's our first 24-hour cycle there. And then the second cycle, we will end with our second marker. And then there's one more. So that's counting 3 days right there. When you go to the midst of the week, you will have 24 plus 24 plus 24, and there's our half. The midst of the week, look where it lands. 3.5 days. It is going to mark the dawning of the 4th day or the 4th cycle. The dawning of the 4th cycle will actually be the middle hour of the week. Do you know that the dawn of the 4th cycle as the midst of the week is definitely not when the sacrifices and oblations ceased, like Daniel said? In fact, a sunset day start can never align with Daniel 9:27. It is absolutely impossible. So we're going to go and discuss this further and find out what we can discover. Surely out of the 4 Gospels, we should be able to find the date for the Last Supper. Don't you think? Out of 4 Gospel writers, we should be able to figure this out. But here's a question. Is the Last Supper the same as the Passover meal? And if so, which statement is true. There's going to be two statements. Statement number one, the Passover meal is known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread because of the command to eat unleavened bread at the evening meal on the 14th. That's the first question. Question number two, the Passover meal is known as a Feast of Unleavened Bread because of the command to eat unleavened bread at the evening meal on the 14th. Well, in order to discover what's going on, we are going to examine the synoptic account. We're going to be doing a lot of reading in the Gospels, and we'll be doing a lot of review, and it will be on purpose. So let's start with Matthew 26, verses 17 to 21. Now, on the first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Yahusha, saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand, and I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" So the disciples did as Yahusha had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. And now we're going to look at the events for the Last Supper. Now, when the even was come, he sat down with the 12, and as they did eat, he said, "Verily I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me." Well, we should think about Matthew 26:17 a little bit further. I think you might all know that when you have italicized words and they're removed, that the verse can read differently. Let's look at verse 17. Now on the first of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yahusha, saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" Did you see what it said? Now on the first of the unleavened bread. Passover was indeed the first day unleavened bread was eaten, but it was not the first feast day of unleavened bread. In the New King James Version, Matthew says it was the first of unleavened bread with capital U, capital B. Is that really when Yahusha held this Last Supper? On the surface, this appears to contradict John's account, which plainly states that the Last Supper occurred before the feast of the Passover. Well, maybe we should compare Mark 14, see what Mark has to say. Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?" And he sent out two of his disciples, and he said to them, "Go into the city, and you're going to meet a man there carrying a pitcher of water. And whenever he goes in, say to the master of the house, 'The teacher says, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' And then he will show you a large upper room, furnished and prepared. There make ready for us." And so his disciples went out, and they came into the city, and they found it just as he had said, and they prepared the Passover. And now, next are the events for the Last Supper. It was in the evening when he came unto the 12, and as they sat and did eat, Yahusha said, "Verily I say unto you, one of you which eateth with me shall betray me." Okay, so we've just read the account in Mark 14, and it sounds like we have the same challenge, doesn't it? On the first day of unleavened bread, when they went to kill the Passover. That's what it says. Well, let's look at Luke 22. I won't be reading everything because we've already read it twice, but let's see what he has to say. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And you know the rest of the story, what Yahusha told Peter and John, and they went and found the guest room. And then we have these next events that Luke records for the Last Supper. In verse 14, "And when the hour was come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles were with him. And then he said unto them," it's something a little bit different. We haven't heard this before. "With desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say unto you, I will not any more eat thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of Yahuwah. Well, looking back there at verse 7, the question is Luke just as challenging as Mark? Do you see what it says? Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. Well, we've looked at Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at these three synoptics, but we will look at the New King James Version. And the context is Abib 13. And the question is, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? This is going to be a review. Matthew 26:17. Now on the first day of the feast of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yahusha. I'm going to let you compare that to Mark 14:12. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him. In Luke 22:7, then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. I'm just wondering, are you seeing that there is an emphasis on the feast of unleavened bread? Doesn't it seem to be emphasizing feast of unleavened bread in all three gospel writers? Well, I think we'll take a look at some other versions as well. Context is still the same. Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? We're going to compare to the New King James Version that we've been just looking at. And this one is from Matthew 26:17. On the first day, notice that day has a red Y. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, okay? In the NIV, this is what it says, on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In the TS 2009, it says on the first day of unleavened bread. The taught ones came to Yahusha, saying to him. In these other versions, for Matthew 26:17, do you find that the emphasis seems to still be on the Feast of Unleavened Bread? It sure looks like to me. Well, let's look at some other versions when we're checking out with Mark 14:12. Mark 14:12 said, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb. In the NIV, it says on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb. The TS 2009 says, and on the first day of unleavened bread, when they were slaughtering the Pesach lamb. In these other versions, for Mark 14:12, are you finding that the emphasis is still on the Feast of Unleavened Bread? It sure looks like it to me. Well, may as well do the same thing for Luke 22:7. And he said, then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And the NIV says, then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Almost exactly the same. And the TS 2009, and on the day of unleavened bread came when the Pesach had to be slaughtered. Same thing in these other versions for Luke 22:7. It seems like the emphasis is still on the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In fact, everything seems to indicate that the Passover preparations were taking place on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread. Well, something does not make sense. If the disciples were actually planning preparations for Passover with Yahusha on the first day of the unleavened bread festival, this is definitely not in alignment with the Passover statute commands in Exodus. So why don't we take a closer look at the King James Version again? Another closer look. Context is still Abib 13. Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? Matthew 26:17. Now on the first of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yahusha, saying unto him, we're not going to read those italicized words. And in Mark 14:12, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover. Luke 22:7, then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. Did you notice there is no emphasis on the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the King James Version this time? Is there more to consider? Were the disciples preparing for a small f feast or for the capital F festival? Were the disciples preparing for just an ordinary feast or for a festival? Let's check out a few facts to see if there is a difference between these three very similar terms. We're going to be watching for a closer examination on just one day. Matthew, Mark, and Luke say this. Now on the first of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yahusha, saying to him, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? So the disciples did as Yahusha had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. In Mark 14:12 and 16, it says, now on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said, where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover? Well, let's look at Luke. Luke 22, then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat. And they said to him, where do you want us to prepare? So they went and they found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. Did you notice it's just one day? It's singular, just one day. So that is something to think about. Was that day when they killed the Passover? Also, the day when unleavened bread was eaten the first time, was that Passover? Or here's another part of the question. Was that the first day of the unleavened bread festival? Which day was it talking about? We have an important crossroad decision. We are now at a point where a decision will have to be made. Do we have to choose between the Synoptic Gospels or the book of the Gospel of John? Do we have to make a choice between? Or would it be better to see if all the Gospels were in harmony with each other? I think that would be better, to see the harmony between all four Gospels. So let's chart these four Gospels. Let's see if we can chart it onto our chart that we have seen before. In Matthew 26:17, we're going to say it again. Now, as the day of the unleavened bread was approaching, this day was approaching, the disciples came to Yahusha, saying to him, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? You're going to see that I added some words in there, okay? The word as and day was approaching. Verse 17 has a context and a time reference. The time reference is a third cycle, and it's before the Last Supper. So our Last Supper time frame is right here on a third cycle, okay, or a Tuesday. And right here on the midst of the week, we have Passover. It is the first day of unleavened bread. This Passover day of unleavened bread was approaching. There's going to be unleavened bread supposedly eaten on the Passover day, but there's a little bit more to it. The festival of the unleavened bread also has 7 days, and they were also approaching. We're only showing 3 of them here right now, but the days of the festival of unleavened bread were also approaching. There is only one way for the Synoptic Gospels to be understood, that there were days approaching that were connected to unleavened bread. The context is about Passover day arriving. And remember, Generally, they would be eating their Passover meal after the Arev into the night season on the Passover day. So it would have been impossible for the disciples to place this request on either Passover, the 4th cycle, and certainly not on the unleavened bread cycle, the 5th cycle of the week, or the 15th of the month. Are we dealing with some translations discrepancies? Remember, John's gospel was written much later than the synoptics, and it's very likely the Synoptic Gospels were already translated into Greek by the time that John wrote his book. John would have seen the definite necessity to clarify the proper meaning around day, one day of unleavened bread, meaning Passover, taking all of his readers back to what the Hebrew mindset would have originally understood. Today, the Greek translation has taken on a meaning that was never intended by any Hebrew writer or believer. Well, let's look and see what is next. We have a chart here. We want to look at the question, is it a feast with a small f? Is it a feast with a capital F? Or is it a festival with a capital F? In Genesis 19:3, we have an example here about Lot. And Lot pressed upon them greatly, and they turned in unto him and entered into his house, and he made them a feast, and he did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. Remember, he invited the angels into his home for something to eat. This word feast is 4960, mishteh. It's from 8354. It can mean drink, drinking, also by implication, a banquet, or generally a feast. So the King James can use the word banquet, drank, drink, feast, feasted, or feasting. But I want to tell you, for covenant calendar definitions, the full Passover festival always includes Passover Day. It includes the unleavened bread festival of 7 days, and it includes the Waif Sheaf festival as well. So Passover is the first festival that we have in the spring. And guess what happens on Passover Day? That is where you have your first feast of unleavened bread. You are commanded to eat unleavened bread at that feast with the Passover in the evening. And then after that, we have a festival. It is the festival of unleavened bread. There's going to be 7 of them. And within that week of unleavened bread, there will also be another festival. It's called the Waif Sheaf Festival. H2282, Kag, is a festival of unleavened bread. And that festival of unleavened bread has 7 days with a feast every single day of unleavened bread, and it also includes the Waif Sheaf. All of these 3 components are included in what is known as the Passover festival. And guess what, everyone? This is Exodus 12:18 right here. This is how you understand Exodus 12:18. On Abib 13, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the disciples asked where to prepare the Passover for the Abib 14 feast day of unleavened bread that was approaching. They were wanting to know when to get ready for Passover and where they were going to do it. They knew that that day was approaching. It's the only way that you can understand what was going on. In many studies, we have found out that it's so important to watch the content. We also have to watch the context, especially with words like a and the, as these words will cause a difference in the final context. We need to compare other versions of Scripture. That's always a good idea too. And number 4, Bible versions that may have italicized words and capital letters where they do not belong can lead to a different context if somebody is not paying attention. So we need to be sure to check and see what John has to say, as often his gospel is the one that solves the controversy. So our first witness for about the day and the date of Passover, well, we're going to look at the Synoptic Gospels along with John, because we have seen some challenging phrases there. But now let's look at John as well. We're going to be looking at chapters 13, 18, and 19. Some of the verses, not all of them. Considering John's gospel, I wonder, have you ever wondered why there are 4 gospels for just one story? Have you ever wondered why John's gospel is different than the synoptics? Many scholars believe that John wrote his gospel late in the 1st century. In fact, they believe that it was the last book of the New Testament that was written. And this would have been decades after the Synoptic Gospels had already been written. Greek-speaking Gentiles comprised a significant portion of the assembly, and they were believing in the Roman midnight commencement for the day start. John's gospel differs from the Synoptic Gospels because of the number of Gentile converts that were pouring into the assembly. He had to be sure that he included any missed details that would separate truth from error, especially when the anti-Jewish bias began to take root. John went to great lengths to emphasize the Messiah's heritage and to remove all possibilities of lingering doubt, especially around the details of covenant calendar, timing of events, and things like that. Now, I'm pretty sure that John must have pored over Matthew, Mark, and Luke over and over and over, trying to figure out if something was missed, if some details were just not presented in quite the right order. And he knew that he had to get the account straightened out in his gospel. Why? Because he couldn't change their witness, okay? He couldn't change what they had written. That was their witness. So he had to make sure that whatever was put into his gospel, it would set the story straight. So we need to review some of the account for John. And this is going to be maybe a little bit of review for some of you. In John 13, verses 1 to 5, really important information here. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Yahusha knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And verse 2 is really important. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Yahusha, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was to come from Yahuwah, and went to Yahuwah, he riseth from supper, and laid aside his garments, and he took a towel and girded himself. Now, it's new information that you don't find in the synoptics. After he poureth water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. We have several other details that we have to note as well. Verse 1 plainly states that the timing was before the feast of the Passover, which is always on the 14th day of the first month. So logic demands the betrayal of Yahusha must occur before his sacrifice on the tree. In verse 2, John shows that the Last Supper took place on the same night that Judas Iscariot betrayed Yahusha. It's not hard to understand. Does this sound very different than what the Synoptic Gospels had to share with us? Let's do a little bit more review for John's timing of the Last Supper. John's timing of the Last Supper is obviously referring to the night of Abib 13. Sadly, everyone, the Synoptic Gospels do not have the same clarity in some areas. But John goes on to reiterate several times that these events took place before Passover. Clearly, the Passover meal traditionally eaten on the evening of Abib 14th had not been observed. Why? Here's why. The Passover lamb could only be eaten after the Passover sacrifice is slain, bled, skinned, and roasted. That's what the Torah says. By default alone, the Passover meal could not have been observed by our Messiah, his disciples, or any other Jews in this account of John. That is really important to remember. Well, let's continue in John 13:21, because now we're going to have the events following the Last Supper, and there's going to be a foot washing. When Yahusha had said thus, he was troubled in spirit and testified, and he said, Verily, I say unto you that one of you, he's talking about Judas, shall betray me. Yahusha answered, He it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. And when he dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. And after the sop, Satan entered into him. And then said Yahusha unto him, That thou doest, do quickly. These events can only occur on the night season of Abib 13, and that would be the day before Passover on Abib 14. But let's continue on in verse 28. Now no man at the table knew for what intent he spake this unto him. For some of them thought, because Judas had the bag, that Yahusha had said to him, Buy those things that we have need of against the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. He then, having received the sop, went out, and it was night. Well, once Judas left, Yahusha gave his last words to the remaining 11 disciples. In chapters 14 to 17 of John, they include approximately 3,000 words that are not recorded by the Synoptic Gospels. But I want to ask you a question about verse 29. Did you catch the calendar lingo? The disciples thought, Yahusha said, Buy those things. This is obviously not the night of the 14th, because he is still with them. John has many extra details. I just want to give you a brief review for chapters 14 to 17, because he is the only gospel writer that records all these additional instructions from Yahusha to his disciples, from the time that Judas left the group until they went to the Garden of Gethsemane. It was information that his disciples needed to have. And these details included in chapter 14, where he was revealing his Father would be the promise of a helper. In chapter 15, he talked about a lesson on the vine and the branches. And in chapter 15, he also told them about a coming rejection. In chapter 16, he gave them an understanding of the work of the Ruach, or the Holy Spirit. And of course, just about everybody knows in chapter 17, that was Yahusha's prayer for himself and for others. It was a very, very special prayer. But John has some other important details. Let's consider 3 examples of details in John's gospel that are not found in the Synoptic Gospels. The first one's going to be in John 18:28. This is what it says. Then they led Yahusha from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Now, this is talking about the unbelieving Jews, okay? They weren't going to go near that praetorium because they didn't want to be defiled. And this is also talking about that evening on their lunar calendar, okay? This is not Yahusha's covenant calendar. This early morning is in the context of the Passover day. John records all of the Passion events with Roman reckoning of time, and the day is beginning at midnight. Therefore, the early morning, that term, early morning, is going to be correct for both a dawn, day start and a sunset day start, and even for Roman reckoning of time. It actually works all three ways. But I want you to notice, no one had eaten the Passover meal as of yet. That's really important to notice. We're going to look at number 2, John 19:14. This is one of our favorite verses. Listen to what it says. Now it was the preparation of the Passover. This is the 14th on Roman time. And about the 6th hour, don't forget, this is Roman reckoning of time from midnight. So 6 hours later, it's going to be about 6 in the morning. Let me read it from the beginning. And it was the preparation of the Passover. And about the 6th hour, Pilate said to the Jews, "Behold your king." Now I want you to note that the Synoptic Gospels, they all count the 6th hour from dawn, from the dawn day start. And the 6th hour ends at the noon, when you get straight up to noon. That was when the sun was darkened until the 9th hour. The timing of John's account aligns perfectly because he's talking about the 6th hour starting at dawn, but he's going to actually be in total alignment with them when it comes to the crucifixion. In John 19:31, another very interesting verse. Listen to what he has to say. Therefore, because it was the preparation, that's going to be the 14th. It was the preparation that the bodies should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, and that would be on the first unleavened bread Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. There's an interesting note here. John is the only gospel writer to verify the high Sabbath is the first Sabbath of unleavened bread. There is absolutely no indication that a high Sabbath has to include 2 Sabbaths on one day, like some of us have been taught. Tim, would you help us with a little bit of reading here as well?
Most certainly. High Sabbath observance, Exodus 12:16-17. And this is in the book of the covenant. Verse 16. On the first day, that would be unleavened bread, the 15th day of the first month. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. And let's look at Leviticus 23:6-7. This is the book of the law. And on the 15th day of the same month, that's in Abib, is the feast of unleavened bread to Yahuwah. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it.
And it's found in the book of the law, but these are definitely covenant instructions, everlasting covenant instructions. We need to remember that too. So now John has clarity with details. As you can see, John points out repeatedly that the Last Supper, the betrayal of Judas, and Yahusha's arrest, and the beginning of his trials, all of these occurred before the Passover cycle on Abib 14. Therefore, the Last Supper also occurred on the day before the Passover. It's John 19:31. He shows with certainty that the day following the Passover preparation day was the annual High Shabbat, the first day of unleavened bread, which fell annually on Abib 15. Always remember that the definition of a high Sabbath is not an annual feast Sabbath that falls on a weekly Shabbat, although that can happen, but that's not the definition of a high Sabbath. Yahuwah commanded the Israelites to observe this high Sabbath every single year. So we're really happy that John actually included that information in his gospel. Tim?
Yeah, I'm waiting for it to come up. There we are.
Yep.
Semi-review. Synoptic accounts of the Last Supper. Number 1, the disciples came to Yahusha on Abib 13. Number 2, they asked him where he wanted them to prepare to eat the Passover meal, which would normally occur the next night on Abib 14. At least it appears that these disciples assumed they would be eating the Passover meal with Yahusha again. Point number 3. Yahusha instructed Peter and John how to find the place where they should prepare to eat the Passover on the night of Abib 14. And that is because they thought they would be eating the meal together then. Point number 4. He told them the owner of the house would show them a large furnished upper room. Point 5. Mark and Luke both state that it was there, in that very room, that they were to prepare for the Passover meal to be eaten. We see that in Mark 14:15 and Luke 22, verse 12.
Mhm. And then what happens after the supper and early the next day? Well, the following synoptic testimonies follow the events of the Last Supper to the next morning. In Matthew 27, he says, when the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Yahusha to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. In Mark 15:1, look what he has to say. And straightway in the morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. And they bound Yahusha and they carried him away and delivered him to Pilate. In Luke 23:1, he has this to say, and the whole multitude of them arose and led him on to Pilate. So Luke doesn't have any details about the morning. But typically, the Passover meal is to be eaten the evening of Abib 14, after the sacrifice, according to the Torah statutes, not the evening before on the 13th, which would be about 21 hours before the sacrifice. So it's really important. This is where the dawn day makes a great big difference. If you're doing a sunset day, you will actually be eating this Passover sacrifice before it has been sacrificed. And that's a big problem. Well, what does this information have to do with the Last Supper? Tim, why don't we take a look?
Okay. It's not coming up. There we are. John has more details of what happened early on Abib 14. John 18, verse 28. Then led they Yahusha from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. And the question is here, who is being referred to as they? Was it the Pharisees, or was it the other disciples? Whoever it was, the Passover meal had not been eaten yet, neither by the Pharisees or any disciples at the Last Supper the night before. That Passover meal was still in the future at the time of this writing.
It sure was. And in John 18:28, he said it was early when Yahusha was led from Caiaphas to Pilate. Well, how early was it? This is where John 19:14 is that very special verse. We've read it. Now it was the preparation of the Passover and about the 6th hour. Remember, that's 6 hours from Roman midnight time. So this is about 6 a.m. in the morning on Roman reckoning time. And Pilate said to the Jews, behold your king. So it was early. In fact, that divine rooster had just been crowing. Here's John's specific timing. It's about 12 hours after the Last Supper and at least another 12 hours to a Passover meal, if anybody's intending to eat one. Just a note for the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew and Mark record Yahusha was led to Pilate early in the morning, marking the Passover, of Abib 14. Along with Luke, their record of the 6th hour is when the sky became darkened, hiding our sacrificial Messiah. So what do we have? Except for the timing of the 4 Gospels is finally perfectly synchronized. It was John that helped put everything together. You might have to take a little bit of a look at all of those scriptures again. Now that the Gospels have been aligned where it seems they did not agree, let's examine an area where the Gospels do agree, about 12 hours after the Last Supper. And the topic is, do the Gospel writers agree that a new day begins with sunset? That's what we want to look at. So as we get ready here, Tim's going to be reading about these verses about where the Gospels do agree. And these are very interesting verses.
Where do the Gospels agree? These 4 testimonies all follow the events of the Last Supper. Typically, the Passover meal would be eaten the evening of Abib 14. By that time, Yahusha had laid down his life. Matthew 27, 57 to 58. Let's look at it. When the even was come, that word even is the twilight mixture. When the even was come, there came a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who also himself was Yahusha's disciple. He went to Pilate and begged the body of Yahusha. And now Mark 15, 42 to 43. And now, when the even was come, again we see even, that's the twilight mixture. I'll start again. And now when the even was come, because it was the preparation, hold on, the sunset was past, the evening mixture was there, and it's still the preparation, Abib 14. What else does it say about it? That is the day before the Sabbath. How can it be that the sunset occurred, the evening mixture was there, it is still a preparation, and it is still before the Sabbath? What happened to the sunset changing the days? It doesn't seem like it changed it here, does it? Verse 43, Joseph of Arimathea, an honorable counselor, which also waited for the kingdom of Yahuwah, came and went in boldly unto Pilate and craved the body of Yahusha. The body of Yahusha was not even requested for until after sunset, when the twilight mixture had already begun. What about Luke 23, 54 to 55? And that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. This is speaking about the night of preparation, preparing Yahusha's body for burial. It was the night of the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. That word is epiphosko, to grow light. So the Sabbath was about to grow light. If the Sabbath had ended at sunset, that would have been the wrong word, because it would grow dark. But here we see written is epiphosko in the Greek, the Sabbath was about to grow light. And the women also, which came with him from Galilee, followed after and beheld the sepulchre and how his body was laid. John 19:31. The Jews, therefore, because it was the preparation, there we are, John's in agreement, because it was the preparation that the bodies should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath day, for that Sabbath was an high day, besought Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the question is right now, what does this information have to do with the Last Supper? We see that they're in agreement. How can this apply?
Well, it's pretty nice to see all of those Gospels come into agreement on such an important point. And we're just going to put some of those points onto a chart, how they agree on this Passover point. And I'll try to go slow on this chart. It's the same one as we had before, with the day starting in the morning. And just note here is the Last Supper. It is on the 13th. It is not on the 14th. This is the evening of Abib 13. And of course, but because Yahusha died on the midst of the week, this Last Supper would have been on the third cycle or a Tuesday in Roman terms. So one example, the Gospels agree that the day begins the morning with the dawn. There is no way that the Gospels will verify that the sunset day is when the day begins. Why? The even of Passover day does not change the date to Abib 15 with the sunset event. Don't forget that dawn begins the Passover day. Right here is our marker for the dawn, where the Passover day is going to begin. We've got Passover day, the midst of the week, enlarged here, so it's easy to see. Right here, second point in this box, we have darkness happening at the 6th hour from dawn. When Yahusha was there hanging as a sacrifice, it was 6 hours from dawn at noon where the sun went dark, okay? Went dark for how long? Well, it went dark for 3 full hours. And remember what he said at the 9th hour? He said, it is accomplished at the 9th hour, and then the sun came back out. At least the darkness went away. After that, we come up to the 12th hour, and that's going to begin the Arev portion of the day cycle. Remember, the Arev right here, this marker, is that marks the absolute midst of the week when the sacrifice and the oblations will cease. We're going to look at the 4 gospel writers. We'll start first with Mark 15. This is what he says, the even was come. Okay, there's your Arev marker right there. Here's the even. He says the even was come, and it is still the Passover preparation day, the day before the Sabbath on the 15th, on Abib 15. In box number 6, we will look at Matthew 27. Matthew 27 says, when even was come, that was when Joseph asked Pilate for the body in Matthew 27, when the even was come, right there. Box number 7, John 19. He says, it was the preparation day, the day before the high Sabbath of unleavened bread. That's what John 19 says. And then box number 8, we want to look at Luke 23 because he's important as well. He says the day was the preparation. This day is the preparation, and the high Sabbath is going to draw near with the approaching of the light of dawn, the epiphosko. So right there, when we have the Passover day ending and we have the dawn twilight coming in, this is where we have the dawning of the unleavened bread Sabbath. And of course, during these night hours is when we had the burial of Yahusha by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. So that's kind of fun to see all of those gospel writers come together on a chart. Now we're going to do something that we don't normally do, and Tim's going to help us do some reading. We're actually going to compare some other Bible commentaries to see if they have anything to say about this meal called the Last Supper. Now, we don't often look at other commentators, but sometimes it's a good idea to poke around and see just what some of them think. So, Tim, can you get us started with Jacob Newsner?
Yes, I can. In Jacob Newsner's translation of the Jewish Mishnah, we can see why the disciples would have been concerned with preparing for the Passover the evening of the 13th, even though the Passover meal wouldn't be eaten until the next night. In his quote from Pesachim 1 verse 30, please remember, he's writing with the understanding that Abib 14 begins at sunset on Abib 13. Very important that we remember this. And in the box on the left, Pesachim is the third tractate of Seder Moed of the Mishnah and of the Talmud. It is concerned mainly with the laws of the Jewish holiday Passover, as well as the Passover lamb offering. Please note this. These people have not read the scriptures very well. Otherwise, they would realize that the Passover is Yahuwah's feast day. It is not a Jewish holiday. Yahuwah says it is mine. Moving to the right on to note. Even though Newsner is using the reasoning that Abib 14 begins the evening before, in his context, he is speaking of de-leavening and possibly anointing the chosen room so that it would be clean from all questionable activity in the past. This rented room might have even needed a good spring cleaning. Jacob Newsner on Pesachim 1 verse 3. Our Judah says, they seek out leaven, number 1, on the night of the 14th, number 2, on the 14th in the morning, and at the time of removal. And B, the sages say, if one did not seek out the leaven on the night of the 14th, that is after sunset on the 13th, he may seek it out on the 14th. If he did not seek it out on the 14th, let him seek it out at the appointed time. That was referred as 11 a.m. to 12 noon on the 14th. D, if he did not seek it out at the appointed time, let him seek it out after the appointed time to nightfall. Now this is the Mishnah. It's the new translation, and it's about the removal of all leaven. I find it very interesting that they give quite a broad leeway for the leaven to be removed. Very broad. New Unger's Bible Dictionary. Unger confirms how the Jews prepared for their observance of the Passover. On the evening of the 13th Nisan, which until that of the 14th was called the preparation of the Passover. See, we can see the sunset to sunset indication here. Every head of a family searched for and collected by the light of a candle all the leaven. Before beginning the search, he pronounced the following benediction: Blessed art thou, O Lord our God. And I say those words specifically because that is what they would say. They refuse to say the name of our Creator. Continuing on, King of the universe, who hast sanctified us with thy commandments, and hast enjoined us to remove the leaven. After the search, he said, whatever leaven remains in my possession, which I cannot see, behold, it is null and accounted as the dust of the earth. Page 411 in the book of Festivals. Prepare the Passover, G2090. What does this phrase really mean? The phrase prepare the Passover, found in Matthew 26:19, Mark 14:16, and Luke 22:13, comes from the Greek phrase hetoimesan, to Pascha. According to Strong's Concordance, the Greek verb root hetoimazo means to make ready, prepare. 1a, to make the necessary preparations, get everything ready. This is drawn from the Oriental custom of sending persons on before kings on their journeys to level the roads and make them passable. Clearly, one of the reasons the disciples questioned Yahusha about where they were going to eat the Passover meal was because Exodus 13:7, Torah statute says, neither shall there be leaven seen with thee in all thy quarters. So prepare the Passover. What again does this phrase really mean? The night the Passover meal was eaten, the Israelites followed the command to remove all leaven from their dwelling places. Exodus 12:18. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, ye shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even. So they were to eat unleavened bread starting on the 14th until the 21st. That is 8 days of eating unleavened bread. Just a comment here. When you observe by sunset to sunset, that eliminates the possibility of eating unleavened bread on the 14th at even. Therefore, this command is disobeyed or at best ignored. More like disobeyed. So sunset to sunset does away with this command completely. Note, unleavened bread was eaten on a total of 8 days, counting from the 14th to the 21st. Sunset theory will give you the 15th to the 21st. Disobedience or rebellion, call it what you may, but that's what it is. The following penalty was prescribed for eating unleavened bread during this feast of unleavened bread. In Exodus 12:15. For a 7-day period shall you eat matzos, but on the previous you shall nullify the leaven from your homes. For anyone who eats leavened food, that soul shall be cut off from Israel from the first day, that is the 15th, to the 7th day, that is the 21st. Pretty severe penalty for eating leavened bread in those days.
Mhm. And the biggest question I have is, how could the disciples not understand what was happening? When the disciples questioned Yahusha about where they were going to eat the Passover meal the next night, which would have been Abib 14, they still did not fully understand that Yahusha's life would be laid down by then. The Messiah would not be able to eat the Passover lamb because he was destined to be the sacrifice as the Passover lamb. And we find that in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7. And I just wonder how much concern and heartache Yahusha must have had over this. But you know what? He didn't want to cause any undue grief. He knew that they were going to suffer a lot. And so instead of explaining to them again that he would be in the process of being buried when the time was going to come to eat the Passover meal, he simply told his disciples where to prepare to eat the Passover meal. That's what they wanted to hear. And after all, they just knew that if they were doing what their master wanted, they would be so happy. So they didn't seem to hear and or comprehend that Yahusha had already told them 3 times, not too long before, that he was going up to Jerusalem to die. He had made that very, very clear. Yahusha used their final meal together on Abib 13 to instruct his disciples one last time before his death. He knew that his hours with them were very, very few. Well, what else did Yahusha provide? After Judas left the group, Yahusha provided many final instructions to his friends. And it's likely that the disciples knew that they were gathering together on the evening of the 13th to receive some special teachings or instructions, as was very common with a rabbi and his followers before the feast season began. Yahusha did give instructions to be remembered forever after, just as he showed them, which is to this day also called a keg. Well, what else did Yahusha provide? Is it possible Yahusha provided this Last Supper room as he knew that the disciples would have need for it the very next day after the Passover, even though they thought that they would be using the room for another purpose? Yahusha chose this room from one of his believers where he knew that his disciples would be safe from the Jews who would be seeking after them. Is it possible that this is the room where Yahusha met them on his wave sheaf appearance, that very same room. Remember, they were behind locked doors. Well, let's just do a review of our first witness for this day and date. From Daniel 9:27, we know that the crucifixion was on a midst of the week, the Wednesday, and the Last Supper was the day before. So the day, absolutely, the Last Supper was on the third cycle. It was on what we call Tuesday on the Roman calendar. And we know that Passover is always on Abib 14. Well, this Last Supper was the day before, and it was not a Passover meal. And again, what would be the date? It was Abib 13. It was not Abib 14. Well, we're looking now at the second witness for the study of the day and the date. We're finished with the first witness. And remember, I told you the second one would be this phrase, with desire I have desired. The true intent of this phrase is going to be examined from Luke 22, verses 15 and 16. We want to understand it because a lot of people do have trouble with this phrase. With desire, I have desired. And you'll only find it in Luke. And he said unto them, this is Yahusha, with desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say unto you, I will not eat any more of it thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of Yahuwah. What does this phrase really mean? With fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover. We're going to take a couple of slides to look at what this phrase might mean. Tim, help us out.
Understanding the phrase, with desire I have desired, Luke 22:15. Luke 22:15 has been used to support the assertion that the Messiah and his disciples ate a meal called the Passover meal. Is this so? In this scripture, Yahusha says, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. The Greek phrase translated with fervent desire, I have desired, is epithumia, epithumesa. It literally means with desire, I desired. With desire, I have desired, that is Strong's G1939. Epithumia from G1937, a longing, especially for what is forbidden. Epithumia, Exegetical Dictionary of the New Testament. The first word of this phrase, with desire I have desired, epithumia, is a noun. According to the Exegetical Dictionary of the New Testament, usually this word has the ambivalent sense desire, strive for, long to have, do, or be something. It can also be used for forbidden desire. Yahusha uses epithumia in this sense in Luke 22, verse 15.
And we'd also like to look at Farrar Fenton and his translation. In his Bible translation, he accurately captures the meaning of Yahusha's words in these verses of Luke 22, 15 to 16. And he said unto them, I have longingly desired to eat this Passover with you before my suffering. However, I tell you that I shall not eat of it until it can be administered in the kingdom of Yahuwah. Do you see the clarity in this verse that the Last Supper is not the Passover? And point B, but he had asked them to prepare for the Passover, knowing full well they would not be eating it anyway. This is another clarification to show that this Last Supper was not on Abib 14. It was only on Abib 13. So we can come up to our review for this second witness on the day and the date. Yahusha's desire to eat the Passover will only be realized in the kingdom. So in this account, the day that he said this was actually the third cycle, and it was on a Tuesday. Therefore, the day and the date of the Last Supper, it was not the Passover meal on Abib 14. The second witness tells us that the date was Abib 13. We're getting a lot of clarification for all of that. Okay, let's look at the third witness for the study on the day and the date. And this is about a very special meal. Could the last gathering of Yahusha and his disciples, could it have been a very special preparatory meal? Is that something that we've ever thought about? Well, Tim can give us a little bit of information on that from some commentators.
David H. Stern, he's a Jewish scholar. David H. Stern writes about the Last Supper meal. The Last Supper is considered by most scholars to have been a Passover meal or Seder. Many Pesach themes are deepened, reinforced, and given new levels of meaning by events in the life of Yahusha the Messiah and by his words on this night. However, Joseph Shulam has suggested that it may not have been the Seder, but actually a Seudat Mitzvah, the celebratory banquet accompanying performance of a commandment such as a wedding or Brit Milah. So it might not have been the Seder, is what he is telling us. Here is the background for his argument. When a rabbi and his students finish studying a tractate of the Talmud, they celebrate with a Seudat Mitzvah, also called a banquet of completion or a graduation. The fast of the firstborn, expressing gratitude for the saving of Israel's firstborn sons from the 10th plague, has been prescribed for the day before Pesach, Nisan 14. He's referring to the sunset here of Nisan 13. At least this has been done since Mishnaic times. When it is necessary to eat a Seudat Mitzvah, this takes precedence over a fast. With a modicum of foresight, and I want you to pay attention to this few sentences here. With a modicum of foresight, a rabbi can plan to complete a tractate on Nisan 14 and thus avoid having to fast. Doing so is not construed as cheating. And in fact, it has become the custom. Is it any wonder that Yahusha said in John 7, verse 6, your time is always ready. It can be manipulated to however they want to make their own rules. It's a designer belief system. Stern's quote continues, the tradition of the fast of the firstborn dates at least from Mishnaic times, but Shulam reasons, if it goes back a couple of centuries more to the time of Yahusha, and if the Seudat Mitzvah custom applied to the first century to the completing of any course of study, then Yahusha might have arranged to have himself and his Talmudim finish reading a book of the Tanakh on Nisan 14. Or, since Yahusha knew he was going to die, he may have regarded it as appropriate to complete his disciples' earthly course of study with a banquet. Very interesting celebratory banquet where you wash your feet. This solution would also resolve the perceived conflict between Yochanan and the Synoptic Gospels over the timing of the Last Supper. This is from the Jewish New Testament commentary. From the Companion Bible. In the Companion Bible comment on Luke 22:15, Bullinger states that the Last Supper Yahusha and his disciples ate was not the eating of the lamb, but the Chagiga or feast which preceded it. He goes on to explain that it follows, therefore, that Yahusha, being crucified on the preparation day, could not have eaten of the Passover lamb, which was not slain until the evening of the 14th of Abib. Thus it is clear that no Passover lamb could have been eaten on the Last Supper on the previous evening. And we say Bullinger knows Yahuwah's statutes very well. That's some good reading there.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that they found some other ways to figure it out instead of just looking at what the Gospels say, right? But no lamb at the Last Supper? No, none of the four Gospels mentions a lamb being eaten at the Last Supper. The time had not come to slay the Passover when the Messiah and his disciples ate their last meal together. And in addition, the verses of Deuteronomy 16:2 and 5-6, those are Torah instructions for the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. Even after the Last Supper, were the disciples still intending to follow through with the Torah guidelines for Passover? What do you think? Were they still planning to do a Passover meal the next day? In Deuteronomy 16, this is what it says. Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover unto Yahuwah thy Elohim of the flock and the herd in the place which Yahuwah shall choose to place his name there. Thou mayest not sacrifice the Passover within any of thy gates, which Yahuwah thy Elohim giveth thee, but at the place which Yahuwah thy Elohim shall choose to place his name in. There thou shalt sacrifice the Passover at even at the going down of the sun, at the season that thou camest forth out of Egypt. So I'd just like you to note, at the Last Supper, Yahusha had to show the disciples that no more sacrifices were necessary after this new covenant confirming meal, instituting new ordinances. And soon they would understand the reason for such a huge change that was going to be given right there on Abib 13, that very day before Passover. There was instructions from Moses for sure. Moses recorded the explicit instructions regarding the proper place to sacrifice the Passover right there in Deuteronomy. The Israelites were not allowed to sacrifice the Passover anywhere that they wanted, but only at the place where Yahuwah chose to put his name. And during Yahusha's life, the temple in Jerusalem was the place where Elohim had placed his name. And that's where the priests were going to sacrifice the Passover lambs in accordance with this command. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, do not conflict with John's account of the Last Supper when you understand them correctly. A careful study of all four Gospels shows that Yahusha and the disciples did not eat the commanded Passover meal during their last time together before Yahusha died on his Passover, because no one can eat the Passover lamb or the meal on Abib 13 before it's sacrificed and roasted on Abib 14. They simply prepared for the upcoming Passover festival. They were fully intending to partake of a Passover meal on Abib 14. Tim, you have a little bit of a review for us.
At the Last Supper, the disciples could have eaten some type of celebratory or preparatory meal in Yahusha's presence the evening of Abib 13. It was at this supper that Yahusha himself, as the Kohen HaGadol, or the high priest of the Melchizedek order, established this new way to celebrate the Passover, that is, without the lamb, through this simple through the simple symbols of the bread and wine. Then he also endorsed the foot washing. Note, Yahusha did not partake of these symbols. See, after the meal, the foot washing activity, Yahusha once again sat at the table to instruct his disciples and give another clue that there was a betrayer in the group. The next clue was the betrayer would receive the sop. This is when Judas Iscariot arose and left after he received the sop, illustrating the removal of leaven from the group. To carry out his plan to betray Yahusha to the Jewish authorities. Would it not seem appropriate for Yahusha to use leavened sop to designate the leavened disciple in the group that was soon to betray him? Was Judas leavened when he left? I think it becomes quite apparent that he was. Yahusha and his disciples obviously could not have eaten a Passover lamb with their meal the night of Abib 13. The scriptures, through Paul, clearly state the Messiah was our Passover. Read that in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that Yahusha died at the 9th hour, that is 3 p.m. Roman reckoning of time. This coincides with the same time as recorded by Josephus for when the slaughter of the Passover lambs commenced. Yahusha fulfilled the symbolism of the Passover lamb by giving his life on his covenant calendar, Abib 14. No future Passover lambs had to ever be sacrificed again. Do you know why there was no Passover sacrifice on the counterfeit Abib 14 of the unbelieving Jews?
Well, we're just going to wind up here very quickly with these last couple slides. We want to do a little bit on the fast of the firstborn. There's been considerable discussion on who ate what and on what day was it in this section. But what do we know for sure? There was no lamb at the Last Supper. The disciples partook of the bread and the wine as emblems of Yahusha's body. There is no record that Yahusha partook of these emblems, and there's no reason for him to do so in the first place. However, remember that he began his ministry with fasting, and he fasted many, many times up to his Passover sacrifice that would fulfill the Torah type. You have to remember that as well. Point number 5. It is understood that the lamb chosen on Abib 10 for the Passover sacrifice was fasted for the last 4 days of its life. Because Yahusha fulfills all the types, then he would also fulfill the fasting requirement as the Passover lamb, don't you think? Could it be that if this Last Supper was a celebratory meal, that he would have been fasting anyway? He certainly did qualify for the fast of the firstborn, even if it was just a tradition. And point number 8, Yahusha would fast often during his full ministry because he knew that he would soon face a very great deal of temptation. Certainly, this was the case for the upcoming events at his Passover. And you know what? There is no doubt that he was fasting. He was not eating. That's why he said with desire, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this with you, but he was not eating. Questions. Is it possible that the disciples would not think anything unusual about Yahusha fasting again, as they would have observed him fasting many times throughout his ministry? And if that's possible, then the Last Supper was very likely a celebration of finishing their practicum with their master. And in that case, the Last Supper definitely was not the Passover meal, and it did not take place on Abib 14. Oh yes, the Synoptic Gospels can be reconciled with John. Therefore, when the topic of this study is approached with an open mind and the belief that the scriptures cannot be broken, you can see that in John 10:35 by Yahusha's own words, we can reconcile all these accounts. John 10:35, Yahusha said, the scripture cannot be broken.
The Last Supper celebration on Abib 13 was the last time the disciples were together with Yahusha before he died. It is highly unlikely that any of the disciples ate a Passover meal during the evening of Abib 14 under this surprising circumstances. However, there is something they did do, and that was lock themselves behind barred doors for fear of the Jews. In fact, they were still there by the evening of the first day of the week, as noted by John. That first day of the week was Wave Sheaf Day. John 20, verse 19. Then the same day as what? The same day that Yahusha presented himself as the first fruit before Yahuwah and can return back to earth. Start this again. Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, remember that evening, that is the twilight mixture after sunset. And here it says it is still the first day of the week. What happened to the sunset? Why did it not change the day in this verse? Is this another sunset failure? Let me start this verse again. Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, came Yahusha and stood in the midst and said unto them, Peace be unto you. Even though they missed the Passover meal on this Abib 14, would they have celebrated Passover in the second month? Torah does provide that option if the first Passover is missed. That's a very interesting
Well, that's
question.
our third witness. Our third witness, and we're going to finish this up with the day and the date. Here is the final answer. The Last Supper was special, and it could have followed the tradition of a celebration meal with the Master. But the day, it was the third cycle. It was on a Tuesday. And point B, therefore, this banquet would not have been a Passover meal on Wednesday, the midst of the week, or Abib 14. The date is definitely for the Last Supper. The date is definitely Abib 13. Well, way up there at 60 AD, Paul has some instructions on the Last Supper and the new Passover ordinances. In 1 Corinthians 11, he says this, For I have received of Yahusha that which also I delivered unto you, that Yahusha, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he brake it, and he said, Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner also he took the cup, and when he had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye as oft as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread, and as often as you drink this cup, you do show Yahusha's death till he come. And guess what, everyone? The wedding supper is next. It's a celebratory meal for the everlasting covenant. That's where he's going to eat and drink. He will serve us. He will serve us himself. Won't that be wonderful? Well, that ends part 1. And we're going to be looking at the Last Supper in part 2. And just a question or two here. What kind of bread was at the table of the Last Supper? Was it leavened, like a lot of people think? Or was it unleavened? Or was there both kinds of bread at that supper table? And if there was both, which one of them is going to represent Yahusha? Well, we would like you to come and see. Well, that's the end of part 1 for this time. We hope that you've enjoyed it and learned a little bit of something. If you have questions and comments, you can send those to questions@studythecalendar.com. We'd be happy to help you out. Thank you for joining us today, and shalom.